I was brought up in the state of Georgia in the 1960s during the civil rights movement in the United States. And the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in Atlanta at the time and was sort of my childhood hero. And Dr. King talked about two stages to the civil rights movement for African Americans. The first stage was to integrate lunch counters and buses and public spaces and washrooms, and we had white water fountains and colored water fountains, and bathrooms for white people and bathrooms for colored folks. And the first step of the civil rights movement was to say, no, 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 people are people, and we all belong in here together, and we can't segregate people based on their race and color of their skin, so they belong here with us. But that was only half the battle. The second half of the battle was to then afford those people the opportunities and the resources they would need to have the same quality of life as everybody else. That's what we have yet to do in mental health. The recovery movement, of which I am a representative, that's why I'm here, is a civil rights movement for these people. Civil rights movement for persons with severe psychiatric disorders who we decided 60 years ago belonged in the community with us, but whom we have still yet to offer the opportunities and the resources needed for them to take up full lives in the community. The first part of my comments today has more to do with involving people with lived experience and their family members in the reform process itself. So there are some common sense things we know we need to do, and I'm sure the commissioners would be in agreement that these are things we can all agree we need to do. We need to decrease the stigma and discrimination that continues to accrue to serious mental illnesses, and we need to reduce barriers to access to care. Only 1 out of 3 adults with a serious mental illness will receive care. So for every 1 person who does, there are 2 people out there who are suffering without care, and that's a huge problem. We need to facilitate early identification and ensure timely access to early intervention. This is a model, as you know, that was developed initially in Australia and has since been disseminated across the globe. It's a very important development. We need to get to care early to folks before they become disabled. And we need to utilize practices that are effective, what we call evidence. These are sort of common sense reform principles. And a lot of people would stop here and say, that's all we need to do. But I'm here today to tell you that that hasn't been enough. It hasn't been enough because it doesn't allow a role and room for people with life experiences that would inform them to inform us in ways to change our services in ways we cannot even imagine. And the future of mental health is going to look very different, not only from the past, but from the present. My father worked for his career at AT&T, which is had been a long-standing telephone company for the United States. And I was in his house at one point recently Skyping with Anthony. So I had my computer and we were talking. He was in Melbourne, I was in Georgia. We were talking. My father walked in the room and he looked and he said, "You know, that's really amazing. It's really amazing that you can talk to someone on the other side of the world in real time and see him and he sees you. It's just amazing." I thought, it really is amazing. If you stop and think about it, it's pretty incredible. He said, "Yeah, I remember back in the 1960s when the boys at Bell Labs," which is what they called scientists, I guess, in the 60s, the boys at Bell Labs told us that there would be a day when you would be able to see the person you were talking to on the phone. And we thought they were crazy. And here it is, 60 years later, but here it is. What is my point? My point is, well, and one other piece of this. So I went back and I did a little history, did a little search of history to see, in fact, when the boys at Bell Labs had discovered this potential. And what I found out is that it was 1978 when the first wireless telephone was invented. And it was huge. It was like this big. There's a picture I have of the guy holding it up to his head. It's about this big. So they invented wireless connectivity in 1978, and it's taken now 50 years, almost 50 years, to get from there to the iPhone. I don't have mine on me, but you know what I'm talking about. My point in going through this little historical story is that we are at the beginning of the recovery movement, not at the end. And we have realized that people with serious mental illnesses can be disconnected from hospitals. They don't have to be in hospitals, and in fact, hospitals, for the most part, are damaging rather than therapeutic or curative or whatever you want to call it. But we have a long way to go. We have at least a generation or two before we're going to realize a vision of mental health care that's substantially, significantly different from what we have today. So what we need to do is rethink the relationship of care to recovery. Care is not curative, but care can promote recovery. We need to rethink the role of the practitioner. We need to shift the focus from what we can't change, which is that the person has a mental illness, to what we can change, which is what is the quality of their life, given that they have a mental illness. And to do what I was just describing, to rethink the role of the practitioner, to rethink the role of care, we need to learn from people in recovery. They need to be the ones to teach us how to do things differently. The major point I was asked to make, which is that patients need to be leaders of the reform. It can't be 1 or 6 or 12 people. It has to be hundreds of people, thousands of people.